one book written by futurist Ray Kurzweil, he wrote a book in 2005 called The Singularity is Near, and which the singularity by his definition
Stop.
is what?
Oh, Blevin, I said the singularity is near. Bong.
In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, man.
Happy New Year. You know, there's always that, like, how long after the New Year starts do you continue saying Happy New Year to people? I
7
figure the
days.
first time you see somebody in the new year, you could still say Happy New Year.
I always went with just 7 days, man. After 7 days, we're ended up to our necks.
By the way, this is not work. This is play. And the reason it's not work is because I don't work on January 8th because that's the king's birthday. I'm Steve Benson. That's Paul Schultz. This is the Don't Panic Radio Show 2025. Sit back, relax, and ignore the news because nothing you're about to hear is true.
What a time.
2025. Who could have predicted that this is what life in the world would be like in 2020? This is the future. This is, depending on how you count, this is either the last year of the first quarter of the 21st century or the first year of the second quarter of the 21st century, which means we're on the downslide of the first half of the 21st century. Buck
These
Rogers,
men are so
I haven't
drunk,
seen Buck.
they don't know where they are.
Where are we? I don't know. I haven't seen Buck Rogers. I haven't seen, what is it what they always say, flying cars? Like,
Yeah.
Where are my floating cities? Where are my flying cars?
Funnily enough, if mentioning Buck Rogers, as of 2025, Buck Rogers, at least his first appearance, has entered the public domain this year.
Well, there you go. Maybe we'll just, welcome to the Buck Rogers radio show. We're just going to play old episodes of Buck Rogers and Mickey Mouse.
Hey, that would work.
But this is
the serials are in the public domain. Sorry.
An episode of where we're going to talk about a brief history of the future. So we used to think we'd have flying cars. We thought all of our problems would be solved by the year 2000.
Year 2000.
We'd have Mars colonized. We would have contacted extraterrestrials. I mean, you remember what it was like in the 20th century. In the late 20th century, we just had all these predictions about what the future would be like. You go back to the 50s, it's like everybody would be, by now, we're supposed to all be wearing that, like, aluminum foil looking
like the Space Family Robinson.
Exactly, with the funny boots, right? But somehow the people in the future always still had the same haircut of whatever era you're,
Well, who would have thought that, like, all those kids' books that I read back in the early 70s that were written in the 50s about the 2000s would be wrong.
Right? Oh, it's fun to think about, though, because I've for a while I've been interested in the idea of a history of the future and how people looked at the future, predicted the future, how they thought the future would be at different points in time in the past. And since I'm interested in it, I've never really dug into it, like trying to figure it out and really look at throughout history how people looked at the future. So this is my opportunity, and y'all gonna come along for the ride. For example,
whether you like it or not.
Whether you like it or not. If you think about, like, the earliest humans, earliest humans were just kind of like, this is how it, they have a memory of, and they have the tales that are told around the campfire. So really the past, like all they know about the past is probably just a couple of generations because those stories change with time, and stuff.
Hmm.
And they probably projected out into the future based on seasonal changes and like, what's the future going to be like, Ma? Well, it's going to get cold later this year, and then it's going to get warm again after that, and some plants are going to grow, and but then
Yeah.
you start seeing mythology and religion and rituals and stuff. So probably then it's going to be like, okay, we still have the seasons if we sacrifice enough virgins, but eventually, the gods are going to return and whatever. That's kind of probably how they thought about the future, but they never thought of it in terms of like, well, we're going to stop using these hand axes and we'll invent meat slicers. They didn't
Hmm.
really think of it that way. Ancient, so yeah, the ancient civilizations, then they start getting astronomy and calendars, and the Mayans are like, yeah, we'll go all the way out to 2012.
That's right. After that, we'll figure it out later. We'll be around. We'll figure it out later.
Which, you know, if you think about the Mayan calendar that said that kind of ended in 2012, that was pretty funny. And that
Yeah.
you got that whole movie, like all these people thinking, well, that's because the Mayans knew the world was going to come to an end in 2012. I'm like, man, they didn't know what 2012 was.
Right.
Like they're like, let's make a calendar. How far out should it go? I don't know. How much space you got on that rock or whatever they used.
Seven time.
The other ancient civilizations, Greece and Hebrews and stuff, the Greeks had their oracles,
Hmm.
like the Oracle of Delphi, the Oracle of Pythia, and they would predict the future, but it was still more like you're going to go to a battle and somebody's going to win the battle. It wasn't like, at some point in the future, there will be flying chariots or whatever.
Hmm. Hmm.
The Hebrews did take it a step further, they were like, well, if as Judaism and a lot of people convert to Christianity, you get the book of Revelation. That's a prediction of the future with flying chariots and people riding horses in the sky and all that. To which my dad's like, well, those are rocket ships. Those are aliens and those are rocket ships. I mean, they didn't know what a rocket ship was, so they just called it a chariot. And I'm like, well, that actually makes some sense.
I'm telling you, your dad was the Nostradamus of Springfield Township. I've
But
said it before and I'll say it again.
I love that. And it holds up to a certain extent. He's like, they didn't know what rocket ship. And anyway, chariots can't fly. Everybody knows that. So it had to be aliens.
I mean, his logic track is sound, man.
It's true.
It can't be that. So obviously, it's that way over there. It's not like a slight leap. It's like a total.
Yeah, not only that, but heaven's a planet. Fast forward medieval period, and notice nobody in the ancient times predicted the medieval period, although you get the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, right? And so
Hmm.
they're considered ancient, so their stuff was still the oracles, and they kind of took a lot of Greek philosophy, but their
Hmm.
predictions of the future were still like, yeah, Rome's going to get bigger and last forever. That's my prediction of the future, right?
Hmm.
Um, but then, Rome falls and technology takes a step back. And a lot of what the medieval folks kind of saw about the future, I believe, is when we dig into it, it's probably going to look real similar to what the ancient people thought about the future, because the medieval period was really a time of lesser technology than they had during the Roman time, right?
Hmm.
So maybe the medieval guys are like, we will have aqueducts in the future. It's like, man, we had that in the past. The Romans are like, we had that in the past. It's like, yeah, but we'll rebuild the aqueducts. That's our future.
In the future, you'll be able to wear sundials on your wrist. That's crazy. You gotta turn,
Like the Flintstones, right? They would
Mm.
have the sundials on their wrist. And one thing I think is also is medieval times we're talking really about when you look at alchemy and early science, things like that, where they sort of try to form models of, because that's kind of one way to predict the future is kind of develop a model and say it's always worked
Hmm.
this way. If it keeps
Hmm.
working that way, here's what the future will look like. That's
Yeah.
really only the rich people, right? If you're looking at peasants, this was to bring my dad back into it. I saw this
Hmm.
interesting thing on Reddit that said somebody was like, you don't see a lot of writing about what it must have been like for peasants, in the medieval times or in Roman
Hmm.
times or whenever. You don't get the story of what was it like for the peasants. And somebody said, if you really want to know, if you want to get a good concept of how medieval peasants lived, take a look at the rural South in the early 20th century, late 19th century,
Hmm.
whether it's Appalachia but probably less Appalachia and more like the farmland, sharecropping and stuff like that
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the rural South. And they said that's probably what life was like for a medieval peasant. Lots of sustenance farming. You grow enough for yourself. If you had any leftover, you could trade it for a cow or some chickens or whatever, or to
Some
have
magic
somebody
beans.
fix up your house. You don't have electricity. You don't have running water. You shit in the woods. You you poop in the woods. Um, and I took that idea to my dad, and I was like, you grew up in the rural South, you know? What do you think of somebody saying it's probably what it was like for a medieval peasant? He's like, I don't know. What was it like for a medieval peasant? I'm like, well, your day-to-day life was the same as the day-to-day life that your dad had, that your grandpa had, that your great-grandparents had. Nothing ever
Hmm.
changed. You didn't expect anything to change in the future. It's just, this is how you farm. This is how you get by. This is how we'll always get by. And he's like, yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah. It's kind of like when you and I talked about A Christmas Story and about how we didn't realize it was the 50s because we were living like that in the
in
70s
the
and
70s,
80s.
yeah. Yep. So that's the medieval period. It's the Renaissance and the Enlightenment is where I think everyday people like start to. That's part of what the Renaissance and the Enlightenment was. It was like we got printing presses now. People can read. Um, People are actually starting to. There's it's more than sustenance farming now. So now that there's surplus food, some people have time to sit around and think and invent stuff. And it's also the time of like Kepler and Newton. So they start these we talk about models to predict the future.
Hmm.
These guys start putting together the scientific method and really modeling the solar system, modeling stars, and start going, there's more out there, right? There's more in
Yeah.
the future. We may not know exactly what's going to happen, but we can predict where this planet's going to be, where these stars are going to be, in the future.
I think a lot of those, like you see a lot of the illustrations that they did of like the stars and stuff on these
Yeah.
old maps that these guys made. I think honestly what it is it's more of a flex to show off their drawing skills than what's actually going on. Because there's always something really like the ring that surrounds everything is always really nicely done. There's a really good banner running across
Yeah.
it. It's like and here's a little tree over here to show that it's they're just showing off your art skills. Show me what's in
That's
the
a good
we don't know.
point. We don't have that anymore, do we? Like if you get a star map, you don't get that nice, like some cherubs around the corners,
Yeah.
you don't get that anymore. This is also, Da Vinci did more than just the Mona Lisa, right?
Mm-hmm.
He made
Couple
these
things.
illustrations of like one of them's like a helicopter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he could envision, you talk about flying cars, here's a flying car, a helicopter.
Mm-hmm.
The ornithopters, one of the things before we figured out aerodynamics and all that stuff is the flapping winged airplane, right?
Yeah.
Um, so they were making drawings and stuff of those and diagrams. They didn't have the technology to make it work, mainly because they couldn't make materials light enough to make it
You're right.
work.
Right.
The reason birds can fly is their skeletons are basically hollow, right? So they have really light materials they're working with. We're sitting here trying to use oak to make a wing. It's not going to work,
Yeah.
right?
One of the heaviest woods on the planet. Because
Yeah.
nobody, they didn't have like balsa wood kits back in Da Vinci's time, and they could have just cannibalized the balsa wood kits.
Too bad they hadn't discovered the balsa tree, so they can make out of balsa wood. That's a good point. But then then aerodynamics gets discovered, and then you can fly, heavy metal, like not heavy metals, but really heavy steel and iron things are up there flying around, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Industrial Revolution, everybody's favorite. Like when you talk about the history of the future, one of the first things that comes to mind is like steampunk, right?
Yep.
So
I was gonna say.
So I think that'll be fun to dig into. That might be worth a few episodes, right? Different
Mhm.
phases of steampunk, and the Time Machine it was written in that era. 20th century, of course, it's the other, like now we're getting into the people with the Industrial Revolution, and then with Einstein's theories, relativity, quantum mechanics gets discovered. Futurism becomes an actual movement. People actually start having jobs where they're trying to predict the future. Whole think tanks
Ray
get formed.
Vincent was born. Yeah.
Yeah. Lots of science fiction. Science fiction becomes like a major medium. You don't see a lot of science fiction. Shakespeare didn't write science fiction, right?
Not to my knowledge.
But then you start, space exploration, type science fiction, different kinds, speculative, hard science fiction. It'll take a long time for us to get through the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
AI.
It's like it slowed down. It slowed down, but expanded.
Yeah. That's slowed down but expanded.
That's what happened to me.
In modern times, you look at now that we're here in this coming to the close of the first quarter of the 21st century. Yeah, I don't even know what to say about it. There's just so many different ways to think about how do we currently think about the future. Like
Mhm.
it seems right now bleak, right? And I don't know how much of that is climate change, how much of it is pandemic, how much of it is Trumpism and
Or
this alt-right
all this.
or all this, right? So I've been reading books lately. Yes, everything seems bleak, but a couple of books I read recently looking at the future. Ray Kurzweil is a futurist who wrote a book in 2005 called The Singularity is Near. And he defines the singularity as when superhuman intelligence is invented. Superhuman or not, superhuman artificial intelligence, meaning an artificial intelligence that is more intelligent than humans. And he predicted that would happen in the 2030s, maybe 2040. And then he predicted, like, along the way between 2005 and then, what will some of the milestones be? He's been right about almost every single milestone of the past 20 years. So last year he wrote another book called The Singularity is Nearer. And he's saying, like, here's all the milestones I predicted. We're on track. We're a little bit ahead in some areas. And here's the evidence. And here's what it's going to look like for the next 10, 20 years. And then he goes beyond that. And he's like, with superhuman artificial intelligence, we're going to have even better, like other technologies then will improve also. And he's got a really bright view of the future. Now he's rich. So of course, he does address that in the book. He's like, it's easy for me to say things are going to be way better, but he's like, I'm pretty privileged, right? It's also going to get a lot worse for people. Climate change is going to, and with AI taking over jobs, he's like, yes, I believe we'll have a better world, but it's not going to be better for a lot of people. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, it made life better for a lot of people. It made life worse for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
some people are even wondering whether climbing out of the trees was a good idea. And even other people are like, maybe we shouldn't have left the oceans in the first place. That's that's a meta reference to the name of our show.
I caught
Mm,
it. I was just
mm,
waiting for the audience to catch up.
yeah. So anyway, all of that is just to say this, with those different sections of the history of the future, I think there's several episodes in there where we can really
Hmm.
do a deep dive into those.
Yeah.
Primary benefit is you and I get to keep talking.
Yeah.
Secondary benefit is I get to learn more about this stuff that I've always been interested in. And then even another secondary benefit is our listeners get to enjoy learning
Right.
along
Right.
with us.
Some might call that the tertiary benefit of
I wouldn't try saying that fast. Tsetse, the tsetse fly.
the tsetse fly. Tertiary. Tertiary. I don't know how to pronounce it.
So do you have anything to say about the history of the future?
um, it's gonna happen, but we'll never know.
Not a hey, if Ray Kurzweil's right, we will know because we're going to live
That's true.
forever. How's that better? How's living forever better?
I
For
don't
Ray,
know, man. If living forever means this, I'm
I'll
gonna
tell you what
appreciate what
though,
I got while I have
that's a good idea.
it.
For ancient humans, for Da Vinci, Copernicus, Einstein, and even Ray Kurzweil, and
And
especially for Paul Schultz. I'm Steve Benson. This has been the Don't Panic Radio Show, and nothing you just heard was true.
while we're on the subject of history, I gotta show you my new coffee cup that my girlfriend's daughter got for me. She knew there were two things that I liked: dad jokes and history. So, but she opted for the dad joke cup,
Mm,
and it's basically like the key elements for what makes up a dad joke, and like the primary chunk of it basically is eye rolling. Like if you imagine like uh the money that this country puts into stuff, and think about the military industrial complex, that's
yeah.
how big eye rolling is. But the cool part about it is it has a QR code on the back that gives you like a daily dad
Oh,
joke.
nice.
So I'm gonna see what it is today. By the way, Uncommon Goods, if you're listening, I'm not uh above, sponsorship.
He's not below it either.
How do you know when a bike is thinking?
I'm not sure. How do you know when a bike is thinking?
Its wheels are turning.